So by way of conversation, I'd say that this paper grew out to some extent of a series of seminars, year-long seminars that I teach at the university, which basically study Chabad generationally. That is, starting with a course on the prehistory of Chabad, I would call it, that is how Chabad emerged out of several rivals claiming to continue the path of the Maggid of Mezerich, the teacher of Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and especially his successor, Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who moved to Tiberias at the end of the 18th century, and then moving through just Chabad generation after generation. So I think the generational approach, obviously there are other approaches which I respect very much, which is to see Chabad as intertextual totality. But I wanted to try and demonstrate some of the possible advantages of a generational approach. And zooming in on the second generation, which is characterized by dispute. There were 3 times in the history of Chabad movement in which there was dispute about the succession. And the first, of course, was in the second generation. And the context is that the Hasidic movement around this time we're speaking about more or less the end of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, around this time, the Hasidic movement opted for the sociological option of succession by family or by sonship. And this was a choice. And the choice in Chabad was, in a way, to prefer the son over somebody who at least presented himself and was perceived by some people as a main student or a close student. Now, this dispute has attracted a lot of interest in scholarship, because scholarship seems to like disputes. And second of all, because the issues at stake are very much related to meditation. So this is an interesting example of a dispute about the succession of a social movement, which is based on the question of how to do meditation and contemplation properly. And this is why the second generation of Chabad has aroused quite a bit of interest in general scholarship on mysticism. And I won't, I imagine you've seen the paper as it was in the Dropbox, so I won't go into the whole history of scholarship, which is interesting, except to note the interesting discrepancy between the level of interest that these texts have aroused outside the Chabad world, that is in academic scholarship, not only in Jewish studies, but in general, and the amount of attention it gets within the Chabad curriculum itself. And of course, now, there's 2 sides to the story. In the case of the main rival for the succession, I alluded to before, Reb Aharon Halevi, and here's a question of how, so I consulted with Russian speakers as to how to pronounce the name of his town. And so forgive my Russian pronunciation, but it's something like Staroshle, okay? But we'll just call him Reb Aharon Horowitz to keep out of questions of Russian pronunciation. So, in the case of Reb Aharon Halevi, it's obvious that the Chabad historiography does not go into his texts because we can go into this in the Q&A, but generally Chabad has made a tremendous service in making so many Hasidic and Jewish books available online. But if you go into sites like Hebrewbooks.org, you won't find the books of Reb Aharon Halevi except for one, which I allude to here, the book on prayer, which I'll get to in a minute. So this is obvious that the case of a rival for succession, they wouldn't be part of the Chabad corpus, canon, curriculum. But the interesting thing, and this is something which I hope we can take up later, I just alluded to it now, that even the Mittler Rebbe himself, the second Rebbe of Chabad, there's a reason why he's called the Mittler, the medium Rebbe, the median Rebbe, that he's in between the founder of the Hasidic movement, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and the third Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, Menachem Mendel of Schneerson, that besides being the namesake of the last Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, was a very towering figure, halachically, Hasidically, philosophically, and one can understand to some extent why he eclipsed the writings of Mittler Rebbe, but still we find that it's almost like what they call, we had a lecture on parenting yesterday, so there's the expression, I don't know I guess you could translate it as sandwich child. He's sort of sandwiched in between the first and the third Rebbes. Okay, now I wanted to say something about context which came up in yesterday's discussion, that I think the generational approach avoids two problems. One is the problem of the internal historiography or canonization of Chabad dynasty, which tends to focus on the Rebbes and not on the students and not on the rivals. And by looking at a generation, you can then begin to bring into the discussion, and I just learned this morning that Eli Rubin is doing this now, of people like Reb Avram Mikalisk, the rival of Shneur Zalman of Vladimir, the founder of Chabad, or people like Reb Arno Levi Horowitz, and so on and so forth, or people like, and this is an article that I want to write, Angels in America, Hamalach, the angel, who was a sort of rival of a sixth Rebbe. The second advantage of a generational approach is to avoid a certain decontextualization which happens when you begin to discuss this kind of material in the language of general mysticism. Because, and here I just wrote here two examples. But one is that one has to realize that these texts are always interpreting earlier texts, and you can't dislodge them from this whole textual history that they're part of. That's one. And the second is the Nomian context, that ultimately these texts, in 80% of cases, are texts on prayer, or on specific prayers even. And therefore, to compare them to Teresa of Avila, who actually was of Jewish descent, by the way, yes, or with Bakli, is problematic. To compare them to Islamic and Christian mystics, not that it's invaluable, it is valuable, but it's problematic because then one is decontextualizing them and uprooting them from not only the textual but the Nomian context. So that's okay. So that's sort of the general introductory comments that I start off with. Now, I want to move on and say a bit about the texts themselves. And I must say that I made a conscious choice not to bring the text in Hebrew. And the reason is that I want to avoid a certain stratification, one can say, that I don't have two conversations of people who have access to the Hebrew text and people who don't have access to the Hebrew text. I want to put this on a sort of plane in which we can just talk about the ideas themselves. But of course, if any specific questions come up, I'll be happy to answer them or to try and answer them. Now, so the first text I brought from Aaron Levi is unique in the Chabad tradition, and somewhat unique in the Hasidic tradition because it's usually, there's a sort of common wisdom, one could say, that the difference between Hasidism and other forms of modern Kabbalah is as follows, that from my point of view, which is also a point of view of Gershom Scholem, modern Kabbalah is basically a series of footnotes on Jeff's friend Isaac, on Isaac Luria. And the question is which direction these footnotes take. So the usual common wisdom is that the Hasidic interpretation is psychological, and there's a rival interpretation which we found amongst the opponents of Hasidim, for instance. There's a rival interpretation which is historiosophical, which explains the writings of Luria as explanation of history. There's actually a third possibility because of the Eurocentric focus of scholarship on modern Kabbalah. There's a third possibility, which is that of the Sephardic Kabbalists, of the Kabbalists of the East, which is the Near East, which is just to continue writing footnotes without trying to explain it either psychologically or historiosophically, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Now, what's interesting about Reb Aaron Levi's text is that he explains the processes in the Sfirot, in the supernal worlds, in terms of history. That is, his main focus is to explain the present state, the state of the present, which in Chabad thought, up to and including the Seventh Rebbe, in resistance to certain moves made by religious Zionism, etc., is to understand the present as the exilic state. The present is exile. And this exile, that is, this is a series of exiles going all the way back to Egypt, and to explain this exile. Now, what's interesting here is that here he brings in a sociological comment, but his sociology is very different from that of his teacher, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi. That if one reads the classical, the Bible of Hasidism, as it's called, the Sefer HaTanya by Reb Shneur Zalman, the foundational text of Chabad, from the very beginning, there's a very strong distinction between the righteous, the tzaddikim, and the benoni, the everyman, the median. And Reb Aaron Levi subverts this. Already in his introduction, he says, in this generation, souls are mixed together. Again, it's generational thinking, it's historiosophical thinking. So in this generation, everybody has bits and pieces of everything. So this whole discussion of soul roots and so on becomes irrelevant because our psyches are so composite already. And therefore, he's undermining, from the beginning, the distinction between tzaddik and benoni, that's A, between the righteous and the median. And second of all, that's the first move. The second move, which we see in this text, and I'll just sort of highlight just one again, I'm supposed to be speaking in conversational manner. I must say that it's a bit difficult for me, but I'll bear with it. Kvoda shel Arsania, one has to respect the context and make an effort. But he says that there's a revelation of nullification, okay? There's revelation of nullification of this thing that Chabad aspires to all the time, of bitul, of becoming nothing, so to speak, which Elliot spoke about with great profundity last night. And he said in the present exile, it's only a shining. That is, we don't have direct access to this aspect in the present exile. It's only like catching a glimpse of it, I guess you could say. And he says, except for the chosen, the great of soul, who can experience the revelation of the essential core being, even in this time. For everybody else, it's what's called as if. This is a whole philosophical system that I'm alluding to. It's all as if it's as if we appreciate, it's as if we have access, and so on and so forth. The great of soul that can experience it even in exile, because the system of Abraham Levi and of other students of a Mittler Rebbe and of other people in second generation is that for the righteous, history doesn't really exist. That is, they're still living in the time of a temple, they're not in the exilic state, they're not subject to exile. However, for him, this is just like, I used the term footnote before, this is also a movie like that. This is just a footnote. That is, this is just saying, oh, by the way, the obvious righteous of the great of soul, that for him the exile doesn't exist, but that's not our main theme at all. That is, it's a very minor subject for him, really. The main thing for him is how to work in this as-if state. And then he's got various psychological solutions, and here psychology and historiography work together. But we have the main thing, from my point of view, is that the main thing is that one doesn't, and again, this is very much subverting the teaching of his own teacher. The main thing is that we don't work with the contemplation so much. Contemplation is much less important. Even the emotional result of contemplation, what's called itpalut, being moved, is not important. One actually has to reach a state in which one can worship God without reason, without emotion, that we can just worship God, a bit like one thinks of a sort of Zen kind of language, just worship God. And that's the work of this exile. And this is a theme which afterwards reverberates, I think, in the teachings of the last rabbis to some extent, which is interesting to think exactly to what extent, if he's influenced or not influenced. But okay, so that's Reb Auna Levi, and time is running, and I promised my chair not to need any signs. And so we'll leave it for that, Reb Auna Levi, and move on a bit. Now, let's speak a bit about the Mittler Rebbe. Now, I don't want to go too much into this text, simply because Elliot last night had a very illuminating, profound interpretation of this difference between general and particular contemplation, which is the core of this text from the gate of unity of the Mittler Rebbe. So I'll just make a couple of points here. And to speak a bit about the end of the text, to show what a different atmosphere we're in from that of his rival. That he says that there's those who ask on the meaning of words of prayer in detail. That is what's called the whole Yearnings system of a kavanot, which is to focus on each word, on each letter really, and think of its mystical and theological meaning. And then he says that actually the intention of a meaning of words according to Kabbalah helps to strengthen the depth of a general apprehension. That is, if one knows the details of a Yearnings system, one becomes a better Hasid. If one knows the details of a Yearnings system, one can get this sort of general, what we call in Chabad, the bottom line. One can get, in Chabad there's a focus on the bottom line, which is supposed to move one's emotions, which is supposed to lead into action. And often this bottom line leads to overlook the details of all the Yearnings system. And he says, no, the more you know in depth the Yearnings system, the better you will be able to get to this bechen, to this bottom line, to this upshot. And from my point of view, this text underlines what I've trying to say for the last 5 or 6 years, is that, which from my point of view is just to return to the royal road, the Derech HaMelech of scholarship, is to say the centrality of Isaac Luria. And basically that we have yet another text saying that the most important thing is to do exactly what the Oriental Kabbalists do, the Sephardi Kabbalists do, which is to know the details of the Yearnings system. And by the way, in one letter, which there's a certain doubt as to its authenticity, but assuming it's authentic, the founder of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman himself writes, as a writing here against the opponents of Hasidim, the mitnagdim, the almost persecutors of Hasidim, one could say. He writes, unlike them, we are like the Sephardi Kabbalists, that we stick to Isaac Luria, yes, in fire and in water, we stick to him with great loyalty. Okay, so now I think I should probably wrap up. I'll just want to say two more things. One is to show, again, following the generational approach, that actually, from what I've argued today, the Mittler Rebbe the second Rebbe of Chabad is closer to the general thrust of modern Kabbalah. That's true. He's also closer to the teachings of Shneur Zalman Miladi, because I think I've pointed at some very strong differences between the Baal HaTanya and Rabbi Horowitz. However, I think that Rabbi Aharon Halevi is actually closer to the general movement of the Hasidism of the Maggid of Mezrich. And Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, and actually is closer in some ways to the rivals of Chabad for the succession of the court, what's called today, in my view, misleadingly, the court of the Maggid's table. There's all kinds of language around that, which assumes as if it was some kind of unity between them. But the general Hasidic movement is against this notion of dwelling on detailed meditation, and more in favor of reaching a state which transcends contemplation, a bit like certain approaches in Zen that they say that ultimately the goal of meditation is to transcend meditation. It's a bit like the phrase Jeff uses sometimes, religion of no religion, it's a meditation of no meditation, or what they call in Japan shikantaza, which is just sitting, as I was saying before, like he was saying, just worshipping God, okay, just sitting. That is meditation which doesn't have any technique, which doesn't have any focus, which doesn't have any concentration. And I believe one can find this idea in the writings of Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, and here I've been Menachem Nachman of Chernobyl, that he also has a similar approach. And this is a text which I think it's worth reading, with your permission. It's worth reading this text that he says, every time the tzaddik, now Menachem Mendel of Chernobyl, unlike Rabbi Aharon Halevi, does use this trope of a tzaddik, but he says, every time the tzaddik arrives at a greater level, he considers himself to be more to be nothing. So nothingness is relative. And this is another idea of relativity that I didn't have time to go into. And he's not allowed to imagine that he's in that exalted level, because all the time he's seen more and more levels until he realizes that he has not yet attained anything. And this is this kind of Zen atmosphere, that not yet attained anything, the sense that if one knows the Lurianic system, one has got somewhere. From this point of view is a mistake. This is, I think, the general Hasidic view. And therefore, this shows that when Chabad chose to make the second Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, the successor of a movement, they were choosing to follow a unique path. They were choosing to establish sociologically their own unique identity and to set themselves apart of what in Chabad is known as Hasidut HaKlalit, yes, general Hasidism, miscellaneous. Okay, okay. So I just wanted to and then I bring a quote from Reb Nachman: if God forbid one imagines one has attained something, one has not arrived at all at wisdom. And even though I'm not a great fan of this writer, I thought it would be appropriate to conclude with just an important American philosopher, Richard Rorty, who writes that the goal of philosophy is to prevent man, it's interesting, in 1979 they would still be able to write man, prevent man from deluding himself with the notion that he knows himself or anything else. Thank you.